Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today here at your forum on leadership and motivational command. I should say, you'll notice the bit in brackets there that says retired. I completed my service, as you know, in the Army in 2012 and then joined IDG, and I'm going to put that relationship together for you this morning. I thought first of all I'd start by looking at the context of leadership and motivational command from the point of view of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. You'll notice there that it's about developing leadership not only just for the service reasons, which are common to all services, including yourselves, but also leadership for the nation, because eventually we all move on to some other employment or some other role back in the civilian community. And those values that underpin leadership will be as useful outside of the military as they are indeed inside. What I wanted to do was to ask you to consider some themes this morning, okay? Looking at what constitutes effective leadership and what perhaps sits underneath that. And this morning's focus will be very much on the values that Sandhurst inculcates in its young men and women to prepare them for the challenges of operational service. First of all, this idea that effective leadership is about motivating people to do things that they might not ordinarily choose to do. And certainly when I look back at operational tours in parts of the world which are quite dangerous, having that ability to motivate one's soldiers and indeed junior officers to take the extra step that they need to do their duty, when in fact the natural tendency might be to shy away from danger. And I think that's something that is worth exploring. I think also this idea about catching people doing something right. Very often in a leadership context, it's easy to pick on the problems and the issues that are associated with people's performance, as opposed to celebrate the things that they do well. And again, I'd like to look at that from a values perspective. Doing the right thing, even when no one is looking, is, I think, a fundamental part of personal self-discipline as a leader that will stand leaders in all organizations in good stead. And the reason that I've included this idea is to see what way you might react in discussions later to the idea of leadership by example. I think also, and certainly our work around the region and with operational service in the background, leads me to a conclusion that also empowerment of those people within our respective chains of command is absolutely vital. It's a key motivator when people feel trusted and empowered to act with authority, even though the ultimate responsibility lies with you and with I. And these are fundamental principles and values that I'd like to explore a little bit in a moment. And then looking at the relationship between these intrinsic values that act as a kind of a compass, a moral compass for one's operational practice as a leader, and then resulting into action that people can observe. That's quite a subtle concept, but something that is underpinned by the Sandhurst approach. And I'd like to consider these each in turn this morning. So if we deal with the first one, first of all, effective leadership being about motivating people to do things that they wouldn't naturally perhaps volunteer to do. The values that underpin this I've listed here: a selfless commitment, courage, clearly in the face of adversity, and that's equally applicable to your role in the civil defence and fire and rescue response, as it is in a military context. Loyalty, and I'll say a little bit more in a moment about loyalty, and clearly respect for others. And as you see, as I build the next 2 or 3 slides, you'll see that we result in 6 key values that are inculcated through the Sandhurst process. First of all, I'll look at selfless commitment. This is a question to each and every one of us in the room To what extent do we operate as beacons of selfless commitment to those that we're privileged to command? Because it really starts with self. Courage is fairly obvious, and we're talking in this case not only about physical courage in the face of danger, in the face of harm, but also moral courage to do the right thing. Loyalty in this context is about loyalty not only to our peer group and to our subordinates, but loyalty upwards. Do we always point out areas for improvement when there may be some constructive criticism of our seniors involved? That's an extremely difficult concept, particularly from the cultures that are present around the region. But something, nevertheless, that as an effective leader needs to be considered. And respect for others is clearly very obvious. If we've got that degree of respect for others, we'll be looking for ways to press their buttons, to make them highly motivated in potentially a dangerous environment. Let's look at the next one. Catching people doing something right. The idea of looking for ways to celebrate success. From a motivational command perspective, I would suggest to you that this is vital. In other words, to make sure that in your daily practice, you look for opportunities to reward, ideally in a fairly public way, but to reward endeavor. Don't shy away from saying, well done. Make sure that people know that the efforts that they've put in are valued and respected, and from a motivational perspective, you will see the dividends flow. This also involves the idea of integrity. In terms of one's practice, being able to differentiate between that which is really good endeavor and that which is kind of okay is something that an effective leader will make sure that is in their daily practice. So look for those opportunities within your chain of command to reward endeavor and to ensure that that's seen publicly amongst the organization. It will pay enormous dividends. This is a slightly more complex idea, the idea of doing the right thing when no one is watching. It's very easy to do the right thing when there's an audience, because there's an automatic relationship between cause and effect. Whenever no one's actually looking, continuing to do the right thing, even if it's challenging, even if it's morally against the flow. In other words, it might not be popular, but it might be the right thing to do. And this comes down very much to one's internal value system, and something that Sandhurst inculcates from the very first day of training through the academy. And it stands the test of time. It's about making the right call under pressure, whether that's time pressure, danger pressure, or people pressure. Extremely important. And developing that degree of self-discipline within one's chain of command so that people naturally gravitate to do the right thing as a default setting is absolutely critical, especially in a dangerous environment. The empowerment of subordinates, in other words, of effective delegation. I've worked with a number of organizations around the region, both in my military service and subsequently, and one of the criticisms that I regularly hear of people down the chain of command is that their leaders do not trust them enough to delegate responsibility for certain activities and certain aspects of performance. And that's an opportunity missed, ladies and gentlemen. By investing in the delegation of appropriate tasks to those within the chain of command, not only do you motivate those individuals, but you also get the job done more cheaply. So from a pure commercial and cost base, it makes absolute sense. But it sometimes becomes uncomfortable. And the reason I say that is, if you know how to do the thing and you're probably an expert across your own particular domain, more so than some of the people who work for you, the tendency is to get in and do it yourself. But that, I would strongly suggest, constitutes an opportunity missed, because the people underneath you will react in two probable ways. One, they won't grow and develop their own practice. Two, they'll let you just get on with it and not take responsibility themselves. So I think being able to invest in the delegation, effective delegation, is absolutely critical in this context. The other themes that I think are very worth highlighting at this stage, particularly loyalty there, and also the courage to delegate in the first place. It's sometimes not easy to let go, but the benefits, I would suggest, strongly outweigh the risks. And an empowerment and a delegation agenda in a chain of command is absolutely vital to get the job done efficiently. So I would encourage you to consider it strongly. This is probably the most comprehensive idea in the concept of values-based leadership. Developing leadership that inculcates intrinsic values that act as the barometer or the guide for extrinsic action. In other words, there's something that is invested in the individual's development right from the outset within a leadership and command context that stays with them throughout their life and results in direct actions that you can observe and you can measure. And these 6 values, and you'll have seen where I've referred to them in a few moments previously in the context of these different defining statements of leadership, these are the 6 values that from day one at the Royal Military Academy are taught and experienced, more importantly, through each and every activity that the cadets will undertake. And as I'm sure you're well aware, it stands the test of time, not only in terms of operational effectiveness, but also in terms of operational efficiency. And in these times globally, where there are challenges in terms of resource, efficient command and control, I would suggest to you, is something of the Holy Grail. It's something that we really need to look at the ways to leverage effective leadership. And because those values underpin all that goes on at the Royal Military Academy, whether it's a regular officer under training or a reserve officer or some of the specialist officers that from time to time are brought in to deliver specialist functions, the same core values are inculcated from the very start. And this for me was actually quite important because when I was asked to join Inspirational Development Group as a former senior officer in the military, I wanted to know what they stood for. So I'm going to show you. IDG Inspirational Development Group commenced in the year 2000 as a direct request by the Commandant of Sandhurst, Major General Arthur Denaro was the gentleman at the time. And General Arthur put forward an idea that Sandhurst's reputation for leadership could actually help organizations, whether military or civilian, or quasi-military in a sense, to be able to develop and look for a commercial partner. The unique relationship here is that IDG is the only company in the world that has this exclusive and direct access to not only Sandhurst training facilities, which we can bring corporate clients to, but also to align with the Sandhurst values, which I've given you a little bit of an insight to. What that translates to in real terms then is that those 6 Sandhurst values on the left of the screen have been developed into what we might say something more applicable for organizations who are not necessarily solely military, but also commercial and public bodies, those that would aspire to organizational individual development. So you can see there that the mission is unashamedly military in its nature. It's very clear, it's very concise, and it results in something that's measurable and sustainable. And that's quite an important baseline for us to comment on. What that actually means, if I give you actual tangible examples, currently we're working with the King Abdullah's Fund for Development in Jordan to train senior civil servants. where they'll have modules in Amman and also back at Sandhurst to develop their leadership and command presence. We've done the same with civil servants in Al Ain here in UAE, and we work with a number of government agencies in Oman to develop leadership and vocational training programs for example, the Ministry of Manpower there. The reason I'm saying that is, what we're taking is the lessons from military command and control and applying them in an organizational development context for the improvement and developmental benefit of organizations that are not military. So what you can celebrate as elements of the civil defense organization here in UAE is that those military lessons, many of which you'll already have experienced through your own training, and I'm sure there are people here in the room who've actually visited Sandhurst as well, they stand the test of time when the pressure's on, when there's danger, when there's a requirement for people within a chain of command to stand up and be counted, and to do the right thing from a leadership perspective when the pressure's around them. And from that perspective, I certainly commend those 6 values to you. The important thing from our perspective is that by having that direct access to Sandhurst, we keep abreast with the way that they develop the young officers, and we take the lessons learned from not only that process, but also the download of the operational lessons that come from activities across the globe. And I can tell you from a personal perspective, having experienced a number of events of significant personal danger in places in the world like Afghanistan, in Northern Ireland, in Colombia, in West Africa, that the values that are underpinned by the leadership process that Sandhurst embodies does actually work in practice. And it's something that I believe is worth celebrating. I know that your timetable had me down to start at 9 o'clock and to finish at 9:30. It's now 9:30 by my watch. That means I've got you back on track, and I look forward to discussions later in the morning. Thank you.